Greetings, everyone. I'm Bill Roebuck, Executive Vice President at the Arab Gulf States Institute. We're delighted to have all of you here today. Our program today is going to focus on security dynamics in the Gulf, and we're delighted to have David Roberts with us to discuss his new book, Security Politics in the Gulf Monarchies, Continuity and Change. David is a non-resident fellow here at AGSI, and he's an associate professor at King's College London as well. His primary research interest focuses on this very subject, security and international relations of the Gulf Arab monarchies. Longtime AGSI senior resident scholar Hussein Ibish will lead our discussion today. Hussein, if I could, I'll turn things over to you now.
Thank you. Well, David makes a rather big claim in the introduction, which is that there have been other scholars like Greg Goss and Kristen Coates Ulrichsen who have written about the security policies of the Gulf states. There is a need for an update. You say that outrightly, and that it is necessary at this point for a book like this to exist to follow on the work of earlier scholars that implicitly needs updating, in effect. That's a pretty big claim that you make, and I think you fulfill it admirably. I think it sets up the reader for a big payoff, and at the end, by the end of the book, you get it. This is a comprehensive, updated survey of the security strategies of the Gulf states, focusing on where there's continuity and where there's change. There's a great deal of continuity, but also necessarily there has been change because of the rapid shift into the era of conflict and confrontation that characterized the decade or so of the Arab Spring uprisings, beginning in December of 2010. And then the sort of exhaustion of that at the end of that period, giving way to a new era of relative de-escalation, rapprochement, et cetera. In terms of the GCC, the most obvious example is the rehabilitation of Qatar, but also the restoration of diplomatic relations between the UAE first and then Saudi Arabia, and the rapprochement between the UAE first and then Saudi Arabia with Turkey. With that said, I'd like to turn the microphone over to David Roberts, who's one of the premier scholars in our field. And thank you for coming, and thank you for writing this really excellent book.
Well, happy days. Thank you all very much for coming. There's plenty of pressure on people's time these days, so thank you for coming. Thank you for hosting. It's lovely to come back and see all these old friends here. So, the Gulf. Let me talk for a little bit about some Gulf stuff, about my book, if I may. The plan is fairly straightforward. The plan follows, in some ways, the structure of the book that looks at all 6 Gulf monarchies through the lens of political, societal, economic, military, and environmental security. At King's, I'm a security studies professor as much as anything, so if in a Q&A, if we want some theoretical rumination on security studies, we can do that, be a pleasure. But at the moment, I'm going to kind of crack on and into it, really. So the goals of this talk, and indeed the book in many ways, as Hussein sort of says, I think we needed an update. Most books, lots of good scholarship out there, but they tend to be focusing on one issue or one monarchy more than in total. And I wanted to sort of take a little step back and try to look at all 6, try to be useful in essence. And the bibliography and the footnotes in this book are absolutely prodigious. And so I'm trying to very much build on the work of our fellow scholars. I mean, I don't have a grand bee in my bonnet. You know, I don't have a grand argument that I'm trying to like plug away here in some way, shape or form. I have arguments, don't worry, it's not just narrative or something, but I didn't have a particular hypothesis I was sort of testing. It's more reflecting, I think, on the evolution of security strategies, which is where this idea of continuity and change really came out. So in the book and in the presentation, I also went back to, not the beginning, certainly, but a century or so ago to take us through. There's a few new sources floating around that I wanted to use. And I think there are some interesting nuggets of information which we might have forgotten. Maybe you haven't, but I think I've been a little forgotten by the discipline that I wanted to sort of bring out. And like I say, consolidate the literature a bit. If I have an argument, I suppose I should. It is this repeating pattern of continuity and profound change. The profound change is an easy sell in the Gulf, of course. But there is a surprising amount of continuity, and I want to bring that out. And I suppose my further argument is that the central reason for the continuity is rooted in the nature of, as the literature has it, the rentier bargain, in the way the contemporary monarchies have been formed with oil and or gas at the absolute heart of it. And I guess my point is that oil and gas is not an economic thing. In fact, the oil and gas component, the rentier component, it affects everything. And therefore, the transition away from the development of new areas, knowledge economies, whatever it may be, it's very much not an economic transition that's needed. It is a much more significant transition, I suppose. But anyways, let me crack on. So kind of historical order in some way, shape or form, going back to founding and developing. The first thing that struck me was the issue of contingency. And this kind of comes back, time and again. We could be having a different kingdom of Saudi Arabia today. It could be the kingdom of Rashidi Arabia, if one or two things had gone slightly different. If the Brits had landed on a different part of the Qatari Peninsula, maybe it would be the Al Musallam ruling Qatar today and not the Al Thani. And that's an interesting little thought to keep in mind in some way, shape or form. And linked to this, I think that the demise of the Gulf monarchies has been predicted a lot. Going back into the early 20th century, the State Department was full, the Foreign Office was full of dire critiques of the chances of the monarchies in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the transition away from Ibn Saud and the likes. My supervisor at Durham, Chris Davidson, updated these critiques a few years ago. And the Gulf monarchies have confounded these expectations again and again. So there's a continuity there in some way, shape or form. Flipping on to sort of the issue of one of the most pressing or the most obvious issues with some of the Gulf monarchies, thinking of Qatar and the UAE, are the population dynamics, 9-to-1 of foreigners to locals, one of the more unusual components. But that is not a new thing either, of course. The population dynamics going back 100 years and beforehand were sort of similar. Now, numbers are very difficult to come by. I've got a PhD student rooting around all the various figures of populations, but it's really tricky. But very significant disparities is an ever-present in some of the monarchies. What is different in some ways is the political activism of the diasporas, of the foreigners in the Gulf monarchies. Looking to a couple of nice quotes back in the 20s and the 30s. I love the one from 1929, Syrian headmasters in Bahrain were striking in an Egyptian manner. It's a funny little phrase, and I like to bring out these little nuggets every now and again. And that shows the role that I'll come back to in the future, in a couple of minutes, I should say, speaking to the role of foreigners and how that has evolved. Of course, if you want to follow up on this, John Chalcraft, Fred Halliday, some of the key sources here. Oil is the answer. I mean, the problem was profoundly economic. Qatar was, for example, almost entirely destitute in the late kind of 40s. The population dipped down probably around 10,000 or so when the pearling kind of disappeared. And so oil was an answer, but it also introduced a problem, which is to say, who is going to build the industry? Who is going to staff the industry in an extremely pragmatic way? Where is the labor coming from? And this is the great influx of foreign workers in the 20th century, the results and fruits of which we're all sort of dealing with today. And not only did, you have the workers that came, but they stayed, and, this is where we move into the monarchies hosting all sorts of interesting characters in Middle East politics. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Mahmoud Abbas, these sorts of things. Sort of a lot of a grounding in the Gulf and the likes. Played a very significant role in, Stephen Lacroix, our colleague, wrote about this in Saudi Arabia, the Sahwa movement, the melding of, Muslim Brotherhood approaches to more local Salafi kind of elements, and forging, leading in many ways, directing some sort of state apparatus that was very influential. Modernizing, to steal a phrase from, I think it's Michael Herb. So the 70s, we have oil revenues really coming through for the Gulf monarchies, petro-modernizing absolutism perhaps. And, the Gulf monarchies had to overcome this king's dilemma. So international relations scholarship talks about the problem that kings or absolute monarchs have of the more you give, the more people want, and if you give a reform, you can't take a reform back. This is that dilemma of kings. Yet the monarchies seem to have kind of found a way to square this circle. When waves of democracy were washing over much of the world in the 20th century, the monarchies stand out in a rather splendid kind of isolation, which is a bit of a puzzle in some way, shape, or form. There are lots of things we can talk about as to how they managed to survive as they did. I love this book by Toby Craig Jones, absolutely magisterial. So very much my book is very much building on everyone else's, stealing all their ideas with requisite footnoting, don't worry, but trying to build all these things together. Yes. And Toby's book it focuses on the kingdom, but it's just wonderful, looking at the role of development as a critical engine whereby the Saudi government instantiated themselves and took over other forms of potential political marginalized other forms of potential political competition, tribal structures and the likes. State jobs, this is not just in Saudi Arabia, but subsidy regimes, state jobs, mantras of modernization, and these sorts of things. Thus, what we have today, it's back to my own sort of phrasing, my lumpen English, we have a thick crust of concentric rings of support around the Gulf monarchies, people whose livelihoods depend upon the continuation of the status quo as it is. And that gives the monarchies a comparative stability in some way, shape, or form. Although when we think to changes to the ruling bargain, which we'll speak about, we need to sort of reflect on that. Of course, there have been democratic-ish parliamentary moves back and forth, and in Kuwait more recently, back again. There's been a real ebb and flow here. But they've kind of come in, when the monarchies have come under a lot of pressure, they've sometimes moved to a slightly larger enfranchisement in some ways. For example, after Desert Storm, Desert Shield and all that, early 1990s, that's when we saw a comparative democratic flourishing, might be a little far, but moves and instantiation and creation of constitutions and driving them forward, these sorts of things. But we are not in a more expansive mood at the moment in the monarchies, more generally. But we can talk about Kuwait perhaps in Q&A. Speaking of the politics of the monarchies, we need to reflect on the blockade of Qatar. I've written a lot about this. I've spoken a lot about this. I get very bored even by myself when I talk about this. So I don't want to sort of go over this all again. I'd be delighted if you've got any specific questions about it. But I basically frame it, the issue of the Gulf blockade, as the Emiratis and the Qataris both thinking they have the secret sauce to governance in the Middle East. And they are different recipes. One likes to have Islamists, for want of a better description, inside the tent, to engage with them, work with them, stop them going too far. The alternative approach of the Emiratis is, we don't want them anywhere near us in any way, shape or form. We can't trust them. Good arguments, frankly, on both sides. Each, I think, is a coherent intellectual endeavor. And they're intellectually irreconcilable, but reconcilable in a pragmatic way that we see today. That we are in potentially a new era and so on and so on. But happy to dip back into these issues if anyone wishes. We get a bit excited in some way, shape or form about young leaders, about Mohammed bin Salman as this transformative leader, as we should do. He has been utterly transformative. But going back to continuity and change, a young leader coming in and changing everything is absolutely in no way, shape or form new. As I say, Oman's very good chance it would be one or more states. If there wasn't the young thrusting leader of Sultan Qaboos, British support, of course. Qatar would be a very different place if it wasn't for Hamad bin Khalifa, of course. So the pivotal importance of often young, not always, leaders is a new thing. And if you're interested in Qatar, there was a rather good book published in 2013 by me on Qatar for your information. And it still holds sort of true. I wasn't making any hostage to fortune claims, so it's still kosher, I think.
It's an excellent book.
Oh, well, there we go. Thank you so much. Lastly, in terms of politics, let me talk about epistemology, which sounds deathly dull and might be in some way, shape or form. And not a sensible thing to talk about in a policy-interested audience, but hold on, I promise this won't be too terrible. Epistemology is how do we know what we know? What are the sources of our knowledge when it comes to what is going on in the Gulf? I mean, so that's how I interpret it. Like, literally, how do we know when things are happening? And we need to think about this. And the example I use, I wrote this article for the Washington Post, the blog thing, what's it called? The Mark Lynch rang. The Monkey Cage, ages ago, like 10 years ago or more, when Mohammed bin Salman came in. Because he broke all of the rules when it came to how we conceived of succession in Saudi Arabia. We had some written down rules. A good friend of ours, Simon Henderson, wrote about these quite a lot back in the day, about the expectations that we had, the rules of the road when it came to succession, what side of the family, experience, and all these other issues. And the word I want to use is we all sort of reified it. We made it real. I talked about my understanding of the rules in the kingdom. You spoke about it. You spoke about it. We went to the next conference and we chatted about it again. And we sort of made real our understandings in some way, shape or form of succession. And they were real until they weren't. And they were just cleaned out. And so what my point is that we need to be really careful. I am an academic, so I'm naturally something of a pinko lefty. But when it comes to my scholarship, I'm pretty conservative because I'm so extremely aware of what I don't know. And I am slightly aware that the foundations of my knowledge in Gulf stuff, our knowledge, is not necessarily on the surest of grounds. So the epistemology, how do we know what we know? I get worried that we'll have this lovely conversation later and come to agreements on things that might not match the quote-unquote reality on the ground. And so the conclusions that I draw and I try to work with, they are, temporary in some way, shape or form. I want an element of doubt in there, which I guess is why I don't work for McKinsey or something, just giving you the truths and stuff, but there we go. Okie dokie. Societal stuff. Migration and influence, what should we say? I suppose the point I want to make is, yes, we can and we should and we will talk about the influence of migrants on contemporary, the nature of it on the contemporary Gulf. But, the Gulf was not a blank slate. I'll make this point a few times. There was politics, there was influence, there was migration going back a very long way. And that gets elided, I think, from the histories that we look at. The Mecca routes for globalization and a slower but sure form of very early globalization. Oman, of course, used to be a regional power of sorts. It had colonies around the wider region, Zanzibar, and in modern-day Pakistan, which I think is a little nugget that's just forgotten in contemporary sort of reflection on these things. And some of my favorite quotes about Kuwait, describing it as the Marseille or the Paris of the Gulf, back at the turn of the 20th century, Bill Goldberg and someone else in the records mentioned that. Speaking to Paris being this very cosmopolitan, I should say, comparatively cosmopolitan part of the Gulf, hence why Ibn Saud went there to learn international craft and all these sorts of things before he came to power. So we need to we need to remember, yes, like I say, it wasn't a blank slate, and there were lots of interesting elements we need to bring sort of back into sort of our contemporary reflections. Migration and influence, large numbers of foreign workers, slaves, pearling workers, as it was 100 years ago or more. Of course, oil just amplified the need for foreign workers, but the sentiment was there, and oil just exacerbated it. The picture, I think, is from Beit Jalmoud in Doha, a museum looking at the history of slavery in the Gulf. Not a very popular museum, I think, in the region more generally, but they've done it. One interesting thing about the role of foreign workers is how their role has changed. They themselves used to be the transmission source of ideas. They came from and were expelled from, Syria and Baghdad and Egypt in 60s or whenever it was, bringing these new ideas at the time and sort of spreading them in the Gulf. Hence why the Gulf monarchies needed their expertise and their labor, but they brought with them a host of problems from the basic point of stability of the Gulf monarchies. These new challenging ideas, which the emirs didn't like at the time, and they had to juggle with them. But this is also why we've seen the nationalities of migrant workers change quite a bit as well. More and more, I should say, less and less politicized is how the trends have become. The reaction to workers changed. There were communities in Kuwait that were more leftist in their orientation and liked these ideas, and there were communities that didn't like these sort of modern ideas. And so the reception was never unique. It was differentiated, not just among the monarchies, but within the monarchies as well. And of course, it is with the influence of, the arrival of so many foreigners that exclusivist laws delineating Gulf citizenship emerged. Ideas of what a Gulf citizen were shaped in light of and against the influx of foreigners and the likes. These are things that there's a wonderful book on this by Farah al-Nakib, looking almost at geography in Kuwait in some way, shape or form, the evolution of these ideas. It's a lovely book. And there's lots to say on that. A majority of teachers in going back to the 50s and 60s in Kuwait were doctors. Again, sort of similar trends that we sort of see today, of course. What do we want to say about tribalism and, the roles of the Bedouin and the Hadar, these quintessential two types, as it's sometimes simplified, of sort of tribal group, the Bedouins versus the Hadar? I'm not an anthropologist, so I base my thoughts here a lot on Donald Cole and the literature, of course. And it's hard to sort of define some kind of truth as to how critically influential. There's a wonderful edited book by Bernie Heikel and someone else, and some wonderful chapters in there focusing on the tribes in Saudi as well, about Saudi transformation and stuff. But it's difficult to articulate, I think, a certain truth at one stage. We need to be a little, like going back to epistemology, relying on cliche versus asserting something. So we need to be a little careful. But it's a fascinating quote by a Kuwaiti scholar, about the idea about how the Bedouin were transformed into something resembling a decrepit, lumped proletariat in air-conditioned ghettos on the fringes of metropolitan petroleum cities. And so there is a contentious relationship between the evolving state and the emirs who just want to control stuff versus alternative lineages of potential patronage and power, tribal structures or whatever it may be. Yikes, don't know why that beeped. And so before we sort of exoticize this, if that's a word, and we talk about these, Arabian tribes and all that, we need to go back to the United Kingdom. And I love this book, edited by Eric Hobsbawm, about the invention of tradition. He talks about the invention of tradition in England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales. He talks about how the kilt, well, the tartans. It's an edited book. The chapter in there talks about how the kilt tartans are an invented, confected concept, about how Scotland was sort of pulling together these sort of fake concepts from literature as much as anything to create the ideal Scots image. So that is how it was, in the UK. That is how it is everywhere. Yeah. And the Gulf states, in creating what they are, we see it in real time. We see the roles of tribes kind of changing and being manipulated. And it might look a bit false, like there's a false confected, created component to it. But it's no more false than anywhere else, I think, in the creation, the invention of tradition, if you see what I mean. So my point is not to, like I say, exoticize these things. The difference, of course, is that it is happening in real time in front of our faces. The first time I went to Qatar, it was a while ago now, but it was the first year that they moved their National Day. For the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, into the 2000s, National Day was in the summer to celebrate or commemorate, whatever the phrase is, when the Brits left in 1971. That was Qatar's National Day. But as we know now, it's in December sometime, because Qatar was inventing its tradition, changing these things. And they moved the entire day to celebrate a very special, unique, unlikely military victory, the Battle of Wajba by Sheikh Jassim of Ottoman Turks and stuff like this. They were inventing their tradition as they go. But again, going back to the Hobsbawm point, this is what we've all done as well, is the point I want to make. Like I say, the detribalization, the desire for the state to expand its influence. So therefore, what are we to make of tribes today? It's a fairly tricky kind of a question, I think. We might say economically, politically, legally, as I've been intimating, I think, they were robbed a bit of their power in some way, shape or form by the emerging state. Again, the Toby Craig Jones book on the kingdom is important there. But at the same time as maybe according to the laws, tribes were losing their influence. There were other ways in which tribal motifs and ideas were proliferating. Tribal surnames proliferated. Bedouin narratives became particularly important. There was a radio hour called Bedouin Hour in the 1960s. And so there's an interesting kind of, maybe they were losing their de facto, the de jure power, but it became a romantic image of the past, which got augmented. Yeah. Camel racing, falconry. How traditional are those on the monarchies? I don't really know. Not that traditional, I suspect, to be honest. Yeah. But now they are seen as the traditional sport because the traditions have been invented sort of on the hoof, which is, as we all do. The relevance today, what can we say? The obvious example is the Al Murrah in Kuwait, which is a fairly contemporary issue that pops up every couple of years. It impinged directly on who could vote in the Qatar elections a couple of years ago. The Al Murrah issue has been a specific issue of contention between Qatar and Saudi Arabia that we all know. So my point is, specific elements can still have an impact and a resonance through to today. Yep. Islam and tribalism, what can I say? New nationalisms. I love this quote from a former religious police person in the kingdom. Anything I should ban is now legal, so I quit. These things kind of changed a lot. And of course, we have a wonderful expert in the room with us writing about the evolution of Saudi's nationalistic foreign policy and the likes. And again, it's creating different narratives of the state. State foundation and formation, moving the kingdom from the central story of Saudi Arabia being the twin part kind of evolution of the Al Wahhabs and the Al Sauds to a different, more nationalistic orientated kind of a policy. Yep. These things are sort of evolving in real time. So the obvious changes, the cliched photos, you've all seen it before. It's not a very good quality. But we know the Sheikh Zayed Road is the embodiment of, the profound changes in the region. So that has definitively happened. There have been just the most tremendous changes. But like I say, let's not forget that, at least historically, the coastal cities were widely connected, particularly to the Indian coast, particularly to the Horn of Africa. You know, the trade was just pivotal to it. They were not these isolated little Bedouin tiny villages that one might assume that sort of photo over there on the bottom might intimate. There is a rich history there, is the point. Cosmopolitan ideas, we need to remember that the evolution of these things is not some one-way trajectory towards some kind of liberal idea or whatever. You know, Kuwait was a haven for Jews fleeing persecution in Basra in the late 18th century. Two hugely wealthy families in Kuwait were Jewish back in the day, of course. There were calls for girls' schools in Saudi Arabia in the 20s. So again, when we think about the direction of travel, there have been massive changes that we need to talk about, but let's not forget the past a bit. Some economic stuff. We, of course, know the basic story of economics in the region, as it were, that the region is centrally based on this naturally occurring, it's non-renewable resource, it's depletable, it's in specific areas, it is at the mercy of geopolitical, geoeconomic market fluctuation. It's contorted the local demography to get people in to sort of get and extract this resource. And that is, of course, pearling. And this is the curious thing, the curious change in continuity in the Gulf. Pearling was not everywhere in the Arabian Peninsula, certainly not. But in a lot of the coastal cities on the East Coast towns, it was 90%, 95% of the economy. And this is it strikes you. When you go back, it strikes you the kind of the change, the move from everything completely dependent on pearling to everything completely dependent on hydrocarbons. Updating's not ideal, if I'm honest, right at the moment. Okay. This happened in Abu Dhabi, and it was a problem. Excuse me. Anyway, pearling was wiped out in the late 40s, and that completely destroyed the economy of the region, completely, pretty much. So, oil, the kind of the rentier story. Jim Crane wrote about it in a wonderfully accessible way just a few years ago. You know, it's the monarchies that we know today really did kind of stem from the 70s, really, I think, with the oil price rise and the likes. And it kind of calcified the state role. The domination of the state truly stemmed from that kind of era, I think. Subsidies, all those sorts of ideas. The problems that we sort of think of today about masked unemployment, are the locals doing economically productive work? People have been wrestling with these ideas for like 50, 60 years. This is nothing new, the change in continuity here. Vast amounts of public expenditure are based on oil prices, oil income, and the likes, public sector wages. There's lots of issues to speak about here. I'm happy to sort of go into a bit more detail. But again, it's about the domination and the way hydrocarbons have shaped the absolute essence and nature of the economic realities in the Gulf today that are changing. Like, of course they are changing. But I think it's a difficult path to kind of tread. The electricity and the water subsidies that the rentier model allowed to transpire. If you subsidize anything significantly, you're going to get wastage. Of course, that's the way it happens in the Gulf. And the idea often comes across that, well, to reform the subsidy frameworks that we have hits at, quote unquote, the ruling bargain in the region. There's a rentier mentality in the region whereby locals can't contribute sufficiently to economic production. And here we again need to go back to epistemology. And what are we basing this on? Because there's changes that we've seen in the kingdom in the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years have really undercut this rentier mentality idea, I think. I think there have been a lot of positive changes there. Lots of difficulty still, but we need to be careful. When it comes to the sovereign wealth funds and mega projects, there's nothing new about that. Dubai was building, the largest fountains, the largest flyovers in the 70s in some kind of regional competition. There's nothing new there. And of course, up to today, we have visions around the region, aspirations. there's a lot to say here. I mean, all I would note at the moment is that we had a very significant idea a number of years ago from King Abdullah, the desire for the King Abdullah economic cities, the desire to have these $30 billion project to build 6 cities to diversify the economy, and it broadly failed. By its own aspirations, it failed very significantly. And so my worry is that the attempted approach in the Gulf to mandate and drive diversification via top-down enormous projects, I think is a difficult thing to do. I don't think that fits the human condition. And so we need a soupçon of skepticism when it comes to these grand economic projects, is my point. Military stuff, what should we say? There's an awful lot of change and continuity here as well. Ibn Saud reconquered former ancestral lands in the early 20th century to start the third in the contemporary Saudi state. He lost control of his own religiously inspired forces, need to rely on the Brits to mow them down. There are changes and echoes of continuity here. In 1934, Saudi forces went into Yemen. It started off quite well, but as soon as they got towards the hinterlands, everything ground down, which obviously has echoes today again. One interesting thing that I'm looking at the moment, more and more, is the nature of military training in the region, the nature of the model. It's based on a British and or American prescription in some way, shape, or form. Why? Should it be? Is there some a priori pre-existing reason why the Western construction and execution of military force is appropriate to the Gulf region? Maybe local circumstance is different, which is not an idea that's kind of countenance. It's just kind of our way or the highway in some way, shape, or form. And so there's interesting things to think about. Briefly, let's take a hop, skip, and a jump through the evolution of the military foreign military footprint in the region. So, for example, in 1960, Kuwait declares independence, Iraqi forces mass at the border, and the Brits come back from Bahrain to build this deterrence force, so the use of the Brits to deter from Iraqi aggression. From the US side, you have the Nixon Doctrine, the articulation of ideas of the growing importance of the Gulf to US administrations. The Carter Doctrine of the 80s, it adds a bit more flesh to the bones of that. At least theoretically with the RDF, the Rapid Deployment Force, which is a bit of a hollow aspiration from the US, but it's the verbal commitment of the US to Gulf security. We have Desert Shield, Desert Storm, 1990, 1991, which is the zenith, the apogee, the apex of foreign engagement, military engagement in the region, which, is atypical to Gulf history, I guess is my point. And then that led to the basing picture that we know today of US forces in the region. Don't look specifically at the map, but is there a base there? Is there a base there? Just the image of basing. And basing is now proliferated to other nations as well. So this is the evolution of that in some way, shape, or form. What about local forces in this picture? And my basic point is, why do the Gulf monarchies not have the best navies in the world? If Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar in particular, UAE to a significant degree, but a lesser degree because they've got Fujairah and stuff. But if you are completely dependent almost on seaborne transportation to export your oil and gas, which is the lifeblood of your economy, why do the Gulf monarchies not have the world's best navies to protect it? And this is a problem. Partly the answer is in the coup-proofing literature. Partly the answer is that maybe monarchs did not necessarily want to have particularly effective local forces because they believed they had these international agreements and alliances. Perhaps there's that. I've written a bit about this, about the Emiratis offering some kind of a contemporary exception in the war in Yemen. I try to coin the phrase, the protection curse that the US is foisting on the region, I think, creating a mismatch, a misunderstanding of the nature and the role and the potential of US influence in the region. But there are interesting things to kind of reflect on here. I'm happy to come back to this. And so I've long been on record in saying I think that we will look back on the 14th of September 2019 as a key inflection point in contemporary Gulf history. This was when de facto, I think, Iranian drones and missiles winged their way unopposed through air defenses and struck with incredible accuracy the world's most important oil refining facility in Abqaiq and also in Khurais. And so I think this is a sum of all fears moment for the Gulf monarchies. I mean, 60, 70 years of difficult relations with the US, choose a number, $500 million worth of investment in military equipment. I mean, it's for this. It is literally, if it is for nothing else, it is to protect the critical national infrastructure like Abqaiq. And absolutely nothing happened. US might, as it were, didn't deter. US equipment didn't protect. It was, I would argue, a seminal moment for the Gulf monarchies, a pre- and post-Abqaiq reality in the security and defense sphere. I would argue that we can learn that there was a misunderstanding in the Gulf of the nature of the US relationship. To borrow a phrase from our good friend, the professor here, Professor DeRoche, you know, there's a real difference between an ally and a partner. I think that there's a maybe our friends in the Gulf think ally, partner, potato, potato, it's kind of fine. We're allies, we're partners. You call it partner, we call it ally, no problem. But from the American perspective in particular, there is a world of difference between an ally and a partnership, and I think that was forgotten. I think there's also a misunderstanding of what a military capability is. I think there is a belief that, well, we have the technology, we've purchased it, ergo, khalas, we're done, we're protected, to borrow that image from The Simpsons. But, you know, these things don't work like that. And so this is my pre- and post-Abqaiq shizzle. So now what? Now we have slightly more assertive monarchies and more localized focus. What role will China play in here? We can talk about that perhaps. And my ultimate point is more of a mosaic approach to the security, less dependent overtly on the US, less trustful of the US. And that's the reality that we've got. A quick word on environmental security, if I may. So expansion and natural unsustainability. I think that's a phrase I borrow from Mary Luomi, a wonderful scholar of this sort of subject. Obviously, it's a hyper-arid region, which intrinsically, historically, has limited the population for the obvious reasons. But, you know, agriculture has been able to be bludgeoned onto the Arabian Peninsula. If you water the desert, it will grow. And this is, in some ways, what has happened. But with the expansion of population comes a much greater vulnerability to international shocks, to climate shocks, and the likes, I think. And this is something we need to kind of reckon with. Other sort of internal responses to the intrinsic unsustainability, lots of attempts to farm the desert, of course, using the latest technologies of the time. The Brits were there in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, showcasing and trying to sell our latest technologies of how to green the desert. And we have exactly the same thing today with hydroponics and the likes. And they work to a degree, but not to the degree promised. Hoped is the point. And so you still have difficulties here. Sheikh Zayed had a significant environmental focus, that's certainly true. And, you know, as you fly over the Gulf, we've all seen these circles of agriculture. You can just water the desert and it will grow. And what we had in Saudi Arabia is, you know, up to $85 billion of subsidies in, someone will correct me, I want to say the 1980s, late 70s, 80s, where Saudi became the 6th largest exporter of wheat in the world, which is a phenomenal, not in a good way, but the most phenomenal subsidy program, which is, you know, it can be done, but just because it can be done is not to say it should be done. And so what is the long-term ability to sustain this? This is the point I'm getting to. And a last tiny point, the letter from Saudi Arabia that you might be able to see there is from the New Yorker. So if you're students of the Gulf, the New Yorker has a fascinating, irregular series of archives of 4,000-word letters. Letter from Riyadh in 63, letter from Riyadh in 67. It's just an unused, random little source, but it's just absolutely fascinating, I would say. We've also seen another type of local initiative. So Qatar National Food Security Project, trying to sort of work on food security in the region. Baladna is a company that grew up in Qatar after the blockade to, bring sort of dairy farming to Qatar and the like. So again, you can do all of these things. My question would be, what is the full cost accounting of Baladna? Has anyone thought about the land subsidies, the water subsidies, the subsidies in terms of of the human labour required? Is that being factored into the final cost of the product? I'm not sure it is. So again, my point is, what is the sustainability of the current modus operandi? Land grabbing that many countries around the world have been sort of accused of is another potential approach by the Gulf monarchies to secure their imports of food and the likes. The water story is fairly stark. Enormous falls in available water resources, which you can overcome. Because if you have desalination, you can fuel desalination plants and take the salty water from the Gulf, take the salt out, and you have water, and it's completely fine. But how sustainable is this? In terms of the salt you're putting back into the Gulf, so the salty water gets even saltier into the beginning of your process. And then there's the economic subsidies in this as well. And I love the phrase, an infinity of water, which I think is a mindset problem in the Gulf. I drive out to Al Khor a fair bit these days in Qatar, and just mile after mile after mile after mile of green grass by the side of the road. Why? Why? It can't be there. It just can't. It's not reasonable, But there's this infinity of water. You turn on the tap and it comes scooshing out. And what does it cost you as a local? Absolutely nothing. And this is a problematic, it's a wicked problem to deal with. And climate change has real security impacts as well. Righty-ho. So let me draw a few final kind of thoughts. There's a space program in the region. There's been a tremendous amount of change. But I think underpinning that change is a surprising amount of conformity or continuity. Oily path dependencies, as I might describe it. My point being that, again, the Gulf monarchies, the state-society relations are lubricated by hydrocarbons, and it remains to be seen how that can transition to a different kind of economic modus operandi. Migrant workers have always been important, nothing new there. They're less politically active today. Citizenship has always been a bit guarded, more so today. Incremental changes, interestingly, more recently, incremental changes in golden visas for useful foreigners, uniquely useful foreigners, whatever the language might be. Gulf politics, dispensing and sharing of wealth has been, the role of the leadership in some way, shape, or form. So what is the role of citizens within it? Is this changing? Changing for the normatively less good way in Kuwait these days and the likes? But there have been attempts to buy a knowledge economy. The fact that there are US universities in Doha, Abu Dhabi as well, and so on and so on. This isn't new. Plenty of universities in Dubai in the 70s and the likes. The attempts to buy these sort of knowledge economies. And so while I often think that when we think of the role of the US in the region or foreign militaries in the region, I think, maybe wrongly, the picture we have is of the Gulf War, is of the stunning victory in the Gulf War, the stunning scale and ease of the victory. But that is a very unusual thing. If you actually look at Gulf history, it is more a history of the failure of Western states to defend the monarchies, to be honest. So you can go back to kind of, Kuwait under British mandates into the 20th century. And Ibn Saud was nibbling away at Kuwait quite a lot. Under the British auspices, the Treaty of Urquhart in 1922, Kuwait lost a third of its territory. So Britain didn't exactly defend the rights of Kuwait back then. You know, the aid in emergency in the late 60s, the British promised fervently that it wouldn't cut and run. We cut and run, and khalas, and it was a disaster for our allies. 1971, the Brits left pretty abruptly, maybe even doing a dodgy deal with the Iranians about the Emirati islands, so the Brits didn't do well for their Gulf allies then. 1979, the Iranian Revolution, is many things, but what it is also is a quintessential example of the US losing, not supporting, not being able to support its most important ally in the region, the Shah of Iran. Like I say, it is many things, but it is also an example of that. And the Arab Spring. Hosni Mubarak had 30, 40 years of very close relations with the US. Didn't do him much good, I think, as a perspective of the Gulf Monarchies. Similar in Bahrain. And Abqaiq. Abqaiq is the latest example of the lack of ultimate kind of backstopping of Western forces. Economically speaking, without doubt, there are world-class businesses and sectors, Aramco, SABIC, Dubai Ports World. But I would argue they have probably come about because of a lack of central direction rather than because of it, in spite of rather than because of it. And so if there is a core rule with mega projects, it's that there needs to be a certain modular Lego approach to it. If you're going to do something on an epic scale, you need to have it replicable, whereas everything is bespoke and looks incredible, and I worry about that. Yeah. And thrusting young leaders are not new. Right. I rattled through that. So thank you so much for your time. Be delighted to answer some questions and push the hard ones onto Smoothie.
Yeah, great. Thank you, David. That was a wonderful summary of your thoughts, and I agree with you that you build brilliantly on a long tradition of scholarship, but I think your book is a major contribution. So I really appreciate it. I encourage people to read and buy it. Now, we're almost out of time, but what we're going to do, I think, because of the intellectual firepower in this room, we've got a lot of very serious people sitting here. We've got to have a Q&A. So I'm going to go a little later, maybe 15, 20 minutes added time, if that's all right with you, David, because truly, thank you all for coming, and we want to hear from you. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask the first question and then invite people to follow up. Look, one of the things that's going on right now, which reflects both continuity and change, is very close to what you study in this book, are the efforts on the part of Riyadh and Washington to rewrite in a formal way the security relationship between Riyadh and Washington, get it ratified in the Senate, et cetera. And the main obstacle appears to be the Israeli component. But what it suggests is that there is a desire for a degree of continuity in the security relationship that may not be available, right? It may be that the two countries cannot successfully secure an agreement of that kind because it would require an Israeli component that just cannot be secured. But it also suggests then the possibility of change, that if it cannot be secured, and even if it can be secured, it'll be a major change from the Carter Doctrine. It will look very different. And in addition to that, if it can't be secured, then there's no reason for Saudi Arabia not to continue to drift away from the United States, relying more on itself, other relationships, and necessarily sort of be unable to move past the inflection point of Abqaiq and Khurais. And I completely agree with you that for Saudi Arabia, that was a grand turning point, especially since it was Donald Trump who failed to act, and they really invested a lot of imagination in him, considering that he would be something great for them. And when push came to shove, he did absolutely nothing and shrugged. So my question is, how does all that fit into your analysis? And then we'll go to everybody else.
So one thing I'm looking at the moment, very oddly, I'm using a bit of Foucault, and I don't want to send you all to sleep, so I'll be really swift.
Don't worry.
But Foucault's got this nice idea called the dispositif, to try to explain a grand paradigm of, medicine or education or incarceration. So when it comes to the security dispositif in the Gulf, Foucault says there is the visible component and the invisible component. And the visible stuff is the F-15, F-35, whatever it is, on the tarmac.
Right.
The visits, the obvious components of it. And they are significant, but they are also changing. This is a little bit what we're referring to. It's the diplomatic niceties, it's whatever we want to talk about. So those things are changing, and we look at them, and my goodness, things are changing, and what's going to happen?
Right.
But Foucault's second point is, like I said, there's the surface level, but there's also the subsurface stuff, which is the things like the norms, the expectations, the laws, the architectures, whatever it is, all the under-the-table stuff that is actually creates significant kind of path dependencies going forward. So, the teaching of the English language, for example, we've seen, Saudi military officers learning Mandarin and the likes. Mm-hmm. But, to my mind, that's more of an example of, an exception that tests the rule.
Right.
And I think so many of the subsurface components, the doctrinal approach, the comparative NATO integration, sporadic integration with, like I said, the US, British, French, whatever it is, military style, norms, training, these sorts of things. They augur for a much longer engagement with the US or whomever. You can't really just chop and change these things. It is surprisingly difficult. So I suppose my point is the kingdom is definitively in a new place where it is a bit more confident in itself, more wary of the US. So I think it will redouble its own efforts to focus on its own security in a far more serious way in years to come. Yeah. I think the idea of the moral hazard of, we'll just leave it to Uncle Sam, the protection curse, I think that was tested and punctured. That balloon popped in 2019. And so they will try to diversify, but the fundamental train tracks are still Western orientated.
Yeah. And they still want that written agreement from Washington. They're trying hard to get it. It's not, somebody wrote recently that it was some sort of kabuki to embarrass Israel by forcing their hand. I don't believe that for a second. I think the Saudis are serious about wanting that agreement with the United States, and they want it ratified. Questions? This is an amazing audience, so we'll begin with you, sir. Go ahead.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat.
Yeah.
I'm very concerned about the world's realization of what the bloodiest situation is in the world. It's not Gaza. It's not Ukraine. It's Sudan.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
That war, enduring war, is being funded and supported in large measure by the Emiratis.
Well, they fund one side. Then there are others who fund the other
they
side.
fund one side.
Right.
And it's the side that's reasonably insane. If that side wins, we get another Somalia. So I need help here understanding both the Emirati motivation and the bigger issue of the Gulf Cooperation Council tolerating this, almost in effect signing off on it.
Okay, we got the question.
Thank you. When it comes to the sort of the logic or the motivation, I mean, before we speak, we should speak about, the large-scale stuff about, like I was talking about, the Emirati secret source of governance in the region. What sort of character of leadership do they want to see? They want to see leaderships around the region that where religion plays a less significant and driving role. The Emiratis think that is the future. Yeah. So that sort of is one component.
The prime directive.
Yeah, well put. And so I guess the second point that I would make, though, if I may go back to my Foucault, is, so that's the obvious stuff. But the under-the-table sort of the hidden dynamics are to do with the creation of Gulf foreign policy, for example. Now, we're speaking about the Gulf. I mean, the UK, the US, everyone else is sort of similar. But the Gulf monarchies are particularly small in some cases, at least, the Emiratis and the likes. Yep. And therefore, I think there is an outsized influence of a couple of individuals and the importance of personal links. True. Again, personal links are critically important for diplomacy the world over. But I think maybe more so for the Gulf monarchies. So what are the options for the UAE in supporting someone else? If they want to pursue the prime directive, which is a lovely phrase, if they want to try to engage in that conflict, which they think is important, so that Islamist forces or whatever the language is are not going to gain ground, then they're kind of stuck with who they are stuck with. I would suspect that that's the sort of the logic of it. Probably. But when it comes to the intra-Sudanese stuff, I'll just have to defer, I confess.
I think it's very similar to Libya in that sense, where you have, similar parties funding similar parties, and a similar stalemate, which is not a good thing. Another question? Yes, sir.
Tom Parker with George Washington University.
Yes,
you mentioned the importance of Abu Qaid and the lack of U.S. response.
Yeah.
2019. What were the Gulf countries hoping for at the time?
Okay, that's a great question. So if Abqaiq and Khurais was an inflection point for Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf countries, what did they want? What did they expect the U.S. to do in September 2019?
I mean, first and foremost, stop anything remotely like that from happening. Not to be too flippant about it. I mean, again, that is the exact and entire point that of the engagement with the US and the UK and whomever else. It's that no one in the first place would dare to do something like that because of the deterrence on show. And if they did, then, well, thank God, we've invested in this incredible technology. It will surely, obviously, we've been investing in it for generations, spending swathes of cash, then obviously it'll protect us. So first and foremost is that. I mean, I got, depressingly, compared to what I wrote in the book, new information fairly recently about this, and apparently there was more of a subsequent US government reaction, more of a mobilization than I realized at the time, of a reassuring mobilization. My understanding of the US response was that Patriot batteries were relocated to the region, but that was more to do with covering an already agreed movement of American forces to the region. And I might have been a bit wrong there. But, yeah, I mean...
Well, that's the received narrative.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And so the perception is the important bit, I guess.
If it's wrong, we all have that same misapprehension.
And so the point is, it's Abqaiq. It's the most important thing. It's number one oil refining processing place in the world. And if, all the analogies of emperor losing his clothes, I don't think those are too far from what we need to talk about in that sort of sense.
Yeah. But the drive for clarification and restatement of the commitment is still there, which is interesting. So you have, it's desengaño on the one hand, and yet the desire to get deeper and deeper into the relationship, sir.
Just a follow-up on the Abqaiq. And didn't they expect too much of Donald J. Trump, given his personality, given the way he had come down so hard on the Obama administration for coddling so-called Iran? They just misjudged his personality. That's not to say that a majority of the American public had misjudged his personality.
As well, right? Yeah, and so the question, excellent question, which I wholeheartedly embrace, is didn't the Saudis simply misjudge Donald Trump's personality? Didn't they expect from him more than they were ever going to get, and misjudged him as someone who cared about their interests, was a reliable friend, was substantially on their side in a meaningful way?
That sounds perfectly sensible to me. There's a misjudgment of the leader, of the individual, surely. But I think there's a far more profound misunderstanding of the absolute basis and nature of the fundamental engagement with the US. And I think the detail of, that any American government official can go back, well, we've signed these agreements that don't say we're going to do A, B, and C. Right. But I think that the weight of engagement over the years and the length of engagement inculcated a sense of, well, clearly, they might not say they're going to come and defend us or whatever the language may be, but I mean, it's basically understood and misunderstood, I think, is the point.
Right. Yeah, I think there's some truth to it. So I want to go to you, sir, and then Chris, and then so let's do that, and that may take us to the end of the program. So let's see. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Jonathan Chanis, Retired Asset Management.
Yep.
Some people in the United States, particularly conservatives, argue that the Biden administration policy towards Iran is a continuation of the Obama failed policy towards Iran. And it has this view of Iran as being able to be integrated into the region in a positive way.
Yeah.
There must be some awareness of this strand within sort of thinking. Right. If you don't think that Iran can be integrated in the region, the U.S. pursues this kind of policy, how is there any hope for the relationship that the Saudis want?
Yeah, the question is it true? So I don't see any evidence of it, frankly. But there is a narrative on the right, certainly from Team Trump and their supporters, that the Biden administration coddles Iran and believes Iran can be integrated into the regional order as it is and can be essentially rehabilitated without a regime change under current circumstances. And the question is, is that a narrative that's taken root in Saudi Arabia? I think in parts of it has to some extent. I think there are some people in the Arab world who agree with this. There's some noted commentators, friends of mine, who have that position. And I ask them where the evidence is, and I don't get it. But yeah, it's a known narrative. What do you think about this?
I suppose my point would be that, on the 15th of September 2019, day after Abqaiq, we saw reports of Emirati Coast Guard officials engaging with their Iranian counterparts. Yeah. And my point would be that, I'm making this point a lot, forgive me for sort of repeating myself, but there was a realization of, oh my goodness, we are not, by virtue of our US relationship, we have not been magically removed from regional politics. Mm-hmm. We actually must deal with Iran in a meaningful way. Yeah. We can't just needle, and we don't like Iran, and we dislike it, and we're just going to be hard against the Iranian regime, because it was America will protect us. $500 billion, 80 years of engagement. Of course they'll protect us. Don't be ridiculous. Largest military power in the world. Look at all these bases. Come on. It's fine.
None of it is true.
But none of that was true. And so I think after Abqaiq, there was an awful moment of realization of, oh, goodness me, we actually need to have a more realistic and reasonable, maybe accommodationist approach with Iran. Hence the kind of the immediate outreach, and in more subsequently to your question, the visits, the détentes that we have seen, because they don't believe in the sanctity, the enduring nature of American quote unquote protection.
But why still chase the United States?
In what sense, forgive me?
No, the treaty. Yeah, no.
Well, why on earth wouldn't you want that? I mean, of course you want to have your cake and eat it. Exactly. They're not going to sort of, get rid of one, well, the US is finished, we'll move on to something else. If you can, it's like, oh, if they've interpreted that actually we don't have the protection we want in the following three ways, if you can get that written into a treaty, then of course you will do that. Yeah. But I don't think that will ever happen. But of course you want to do it. Of course you're going to redouble your own focus on your own military. Of course you're going to try to dial down the tensions. Of course you're going to wind the Brits in a bit more, double down relations with maybe China and or Turkey or whatever. You're going to do all of these things. And no one's going to throw the American baby out with the bathwater or whatever it is. Of course.
That's crazy. Can I add something to that, which is that in my estimation, Saudi Arabia and the UAE both came to the conclusion for the same reasons after Abqaiq and Khurais and the drone strikes in Abu Dhabi, which killed oil workers. That was actually really that time was the Houthis. That was their own version of Abqaiq and Khurais, really. There is a sense, I think, that when it comes to dealing with Iran, neither strategy is sufficient. I mean that, in other words, diplomatic engagement, détente, de-escalation, on its own is not a sufficient strategy, and confrontation within the umbrella of, within an American umbrella, under an American umbrella, also is insufficient. So that what you would pursue then at this point is a dual strategy, where you have at a certain register engagement and diplomatic relations and diplomacy, and they are glad. When the Gaza war broke out, there was relief, palpable relief in Abu Dhabi and Riyadh that they had already re-engaged with Iran, no? I mean, they are glad of that. You could tell they were glad of that. But at the same time, there's a desire to also pursue the military relationship with the United States at a different register. So you're doing two things. You're walking and chewing gum at the same time, because walking doesn't get you there on its own, and the chewing gum doesn't get you there on its own. So you need you're doing both in hopes that that will be better than, just doing one or the other. Kristen, sorry.
Hi. So, Kristen Diwan, I'm a scholar here at AGSIW. First, I just want to thank you, because it's so great to sit back and just hear someone do this kind of comprehensive overview of the region and touch upon all the different aspects and pull up little nuggets of history and anecdotes. It's just sort of masterfully done, and it's a pleasure, just to sit back and listen to it. Like, I want to hand over my academic classes to you or something and let you teach.
Totally second that.
But I did want to kind of talk about your overall framework, which you kind of put it in the links of continuity and change. And I felt like, at least for this discussion, you really leaned into the continuity part of it. I think for my part, at least, when I look at the region, I really see the change. I do see the change element of it. So I wanted just to challenge you a bit on that. And I think a lot of these things you actually have in your talk, but maybe just with greater emphasis, we can sort of see this really comprehensive change that's happening. On the security front, y'all were just touching on it, but this real move from the overall U.S. security umbrella towards regionalization, where the Gulf states are trying to actually secure their own position in the region through their regional ties or invasions or whatever. And you mentioned, within your thing, 3 big examples that are quite different from what we would have seen in the 20 years before, from the Qatar crisis to the Yemen war. Both of those, you could throw in Bahrain too, where the Saudis went in there, where the Gulf states were very much taking into their own hands, moving out and securing things, not underneath the U.S. umbrella necessarily. And of course, there's the big one of the UAE and Bahrain agreement with Israel, which is completely new. So looking even at Israel as a key and interesting element in their security, which is, again, is really quite radically new, which is all, again, showing this move towards they're trying to initiate their own strategies for securing their position within the region. And we could throw Iran in there too. And I'll just mention that I just saw that the King of Bahrain just said this week that Bahrain, which is the state that has the most problems with Iran, I would say, he said, we have no problems with Bahrain. With Iran. This is the King of Bahrain saying, we love Iran. We travel to Iran all the time. I was like, wow, okay, this is a real change in rhetoric. So that's one mark on the security side. On society side, you talked about the foreign workers, how they've always had foreign workers, but the shift now towards giving citizenship to foreign workers, which, they've already done that, but now really whole new categories of people getting citizenship. Really the UAE leading this and really starting to look at having foreigners, giving them much more rights within the country. They can buy property, they can become citizens, all this kind of thing. This is a big sea change that would not have been accepted by Gulf citizens previously. And we're seeing all of the Gulf states start to pick up on that. So this whole idea of moving from the citizenship model to one where foreigners are going to be a part of basically the ruling system in a much more substantial way, that's a huge change. On the politics side, you talked about changes to the ruling bargain, but definitely the whole shift towards nationalism. We never saw this before. Monarchies are not monarchy and nationalism is a really odd mix. I mean,
Yeah.
to me, I mean, monarchs like usually don't want to instill a sense of nationalism and belonging and ownership over countries. I mean, Saudi Arabia is the Al Saud, Saudi Arabia, right? I mean, it's not the idea to make people believe that they have ownership of Saudi Arabia is rather odd. But having this whole new model of integrating their citizens in, opposed from the old monarchical kind of model, is really striking, I think. And, you know, we could go on to other things, especially the economic diversification, which, you know, Dubai had already started it, fine, they ran out of oil, but now all of them are doing it. And they're doing it in response to a massive global change, which is, you know, the energy diversification and the fact that the main resource that they're depending on is no longer going to be there as the main, you know, element. And of course, this isn't going to disappear overnight, but it's changing fast. And so the whole diversification leads to a whole different model. I mean, if they're going to be having all of these different fields that they're moving into, everything looks different. The way they run their society looks different. The way that they reach out to other powers looks different. These are all like massive changes. So I think when you add all of those together, it speaks to at least this huge shift of the moment from this old bargain that was, we're relying on oil, we're relying on the United States to secure us. You know, and maybe it's going back, maybe you could draw on some of the things you had from history that were pre that, and maybe some of these things are going back to that. But it's definitely from what we knew the last 20, 30 years, very substantial shifts in all of these different areas, I think.
Without a doubt. So, I mean, that's a mighty and learned question from the great Kristen Duvan Smith. Look, I can't possibly summarize it. I'll just say she wants to know more. She's making the case that there's considerably more change than continuity, or at least drawing our attention to the massive amount of change that has taken place on so many of these registers. And perhaps there's been a lot of emphasis on continuity in your talk and your book rather than on the change. I think that's fair. Okay. That's what I can do.
Lovely. Well, thanks so much for that. I suppose maybe I lean into the continuity part in many ways because of that Sheikh Zayed Road picture that I think is kind of emblematic of the Gulf in so many ways. That people see this desert road that's now become this sprouting Mars-like thing. And therefore, it was, oh, well, everything has changed so much. Look at Dubai. Look at the skyline. Look how much things have changed. I mean, I asked Colombia for any image other than, you know, a palm tree, an oil can, or a cityscape, and they gave me cityscapes. Anyways, because I just want to sort of, I feel that the change argument is the starting point in some ways. The things seem to have changed so much. Just look at how much the city skyline has changed. And so I wonder if I emphasize, maybe overemphasize, trying to rail against is too much, but trying to push back against the traditional sort of having things change so much point.
Okay.
That's maybe one point.
In other words, an emphasis on change is the dominant narrative, is what you're getting.
Yeah, but I'll now contradict that. Because exactly as you outlined, there are, you know, so many very important things that are changing. Of the things you mentioned, I will probably mention, or probably reflect again on the changes in kind of Saudi Arabia in recent years that really have upended so many of the expectations and the traditional thoughts about how the kingdom operate. I mean, that is like maybe epochal in some ways. The Abraham Accords, quite cool in that sense, quite new. Things with Bahrain and Iran, I'm not having that, if you see what I mean. I think there's always been this grand fluctuation with Bahrain and Iran and stuff. So I'm less enamored by that as a key example of change. But I guess my last point might be that have the underlying dynamics changed? So they've got a new foreign policy agenda with Israel. Not insignificant, but okay, a new foreign policy. So they've got some new inputs to the economy in terms of companies or whatever. Okay, fine. But I still sort of see, maybe I'm going too reductive and too lowest common denominator, but I feel that a lot of the changes are just the end is the same. A lot of the structures are fundamentally the same, and the ways and the means to sort of achieve the same end is sort of there. The citizenship one is an interesting one as well, but until large numbers of foreigners get the passport, I'm going to reserve judgment on that. Very interesting to talk about, very important to talk about, but not seismic yet, to my mind, I would have thought.
Okay, well, great. I thought that was a fantastic exchange between the two of you. We had one last question. You're going to be the last just because we've run out of
I
time.
have a shorty for you. But
Okay.
Even Hussein won't need to shorten. But
Oh.
I'm Amy Burke from Brownstein. It's a government relations firm. And what is your take on the last Arab League summit in Bahrain a few weeks ago? It was kind of impressive, the photograph of all the state leaders, including Syria, being there. Was there anything new that came out of it? Or?
Thanks so much. It reminds me, I think I ignored someone's question earlier. They asked about the GCC. So let me sort of allude back to that. I am deeply unimpressed by the GCC and the Arab League. I am a healthy skeptic of these institutions as being useful in any way, shape or form. Therefore, I'm less of an expert on the Arab League, and people can put me back in my box and I will hop back in. But, interesting that it transpired, of course. And if that leads to some sort of, that's an evidence of détente, I suppose, initial stages at least. But I'm slightly missing the so what of it. And therefore, X, Y, and Z will now happen. That is particularly important for any of us. And I always miss the so what when it comes to the GCC. One day I'll be wrong, and I will apologize to my friends in the GCC, but I think not soon.
Yeah. With the Arab League, it's the other way around. It's not that thus and such, it's not that the Arab League meets and therefore, A, B, and C happens. It's the other way around. A, B, and C happens, and then they get expressed theatrically at the GCC, at the Arab League meeting, and that's why Assad's re-entry is important, because it represents something that has happened, which is that the rest of the Arab world has had to accept his victory because they still have interests in Syria, and unless you have an armed force on the ground in Syria, there's no way of pursuing your interests in that country without dealing with the government there. That's, so either you can walk away, or you can get an armed force and try to do something with that, or you have to deal with the government. So I think that was, that was what was being expressed there. There are other things that get expressed in the Arab League. The GCC, I'll leave it up to you, and I'll let your skepticism stand, because you've written this outstanding book about security politics in the Gulf Monarchies. I agree with Kristen. This is really excellent, and it is exactly what you set out to do in the introduction. So you set yourself a task, you achieved it brilliantly. Another great book by David Roberts. I encourage everybody to go buy it at once. Hard copy, please. Pay up, and give it to your friends. It'd make a very good Christmas gift and a very good everything gift. So I heartily endorse it. And it's from Columbia University Press, and it just came out. So thanks very much to David Roberts for joining us today. A great conversation, a great crowd. I'm really impressed, and excellent questions. So thank you very much.